What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope everybody out there is having a fantastic day. On the last few videos, I promised you that I was going to do a video on this no-till experimental plot here and compare some of the stuff growing in here to a kind of traditionally grown plot and talk about the reasons why some of this stuff in this no-till plot looks to be doing a little better. So here we go. So on our 2-acre homestead, we have 10 garden plots. And they're all approximately about 1,000 square foot each. And most of these plots we only till once or twice a year. But this particular plot right here is where we're doing an experiment with no-till to see the differences between growing this style versus growing how we normally do it, where we cultivate or till once or twice a year. Now there are several different variations of no-till gardening out there. But the particular way we've been doing it is just by coming in here and layering compost on top of compost. We didn't use any cardboard. We didn't do the lasagna style. We just dumped a bunch of compost here last year and then came in here this spring and dumped a bunch more. So we started out with this experiment last summer, I think. We had a cover crop of iron clay peas in here. When those got really tall and almost mature, we mowed them down, put a tarp on this area, let the tarp kill that cover crop. Then we come in here with about anywhere from 3 to 5 tons of compost, I can't quite remember, and put it on here thick. We planted some cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli in here in the fall that did just kind of okay. And then this spring I came in here with another 5 tons of compost and put it down this plot. 5 tons over this 1,000 square feet gives me probably 3 inches or so of compost. So we've got a pretty deep compost layer here. Now I've had some folks who have said this is not really no-till because you're not using any mulch. And then I've had other folks say there's a fellow across the pond that does it this way and calls it no-till. So, you know, for my consideration, this here is no-till because we're not tilling the soil. No, I'm not mulching. I probably won't ever mulch it because we're growing food year-round here. We're planting different stuff in these plots all the time. The row spacing is always changing, and I don't want to be having to move mulch out of the way every time I replant. So mulch is not an option, so we're just doing this compost layering method here. If we dig down in the soil here, break up some of those chunks, we can see we have to go a pretty good ways before we run into anything that's not composted. I don't know if I can get there without a shovel. So it's a good, there we go. There's finally some regular soil there that's not compost. So we got compost in there probably a good 4 to 5 inches deep at this point. Now I will admit I have been a bit cynical about no-till gardening over the years. And that cynicism is not because I think this technique doesn't work. It's mostly due to some of the no-till proponents out there. They're fairly dogmatic about this particular gardening technique. A lot of the no-till proponents act as if this is the only way you can garden, and if you garden any other way or you till your soil, you're destroying the environment, you're a bad person, all this stuff. And I personally believe that you should garden the way whatever works for you. You know, it's going to be based on what resources you have, how much money you have to put into your garden. So you have to do what works for you. There's not a one-size-fits-all gardening style. So I say that to say this: I was always willing to give this style a chance, and that's why we're planning on running this experiment indefinitely to see how things change in this no-till plot. So that cynicism was mainly directed towards those people who act like this is the only way to do it. And we might see that this is a great way to do it, but I'm not going to ever say this is the only way. So that brings me to this. Why did we start this experiment in the first place? What are we trying to prove here? Well, one of the main goals of this experiment was to determine or try to figure out if the natural biology of the soil that we're feeding or nurturing by not tilling the soil is enough to feed plants without any or maybe just minimal fertilizer inputs. Had a lot of no-till people over the years tell me that If you go no-till, you don't have to ever fertilize at all. And while I don't believe that necessarily to be true and haven't found that to be true yet, I am starting to lean toward the fact that you do not have to use as much fertilizer when you're doing no-till here. So we're wanting to see if over time, maybe that biology will develop enough and we don't have to fertilize at all. We'll just have to see. We're not there yet, but we are making some improvements. And I know a lot of people do no-till gardening for weed suppression. They have rough issues with the weeds in their garden, and that's the reason they go no-till. That's not the reason we did it here. We don't have a ton of weed pressure in our other gardens because we use certain techniques to make sure we keep the weeds at bay. So weed pressure was not the reason we did this. Now, we'll talk about in a minute how our weed pressure has changed a little bit with this particular style versus the other style of garden we traditionally use. Okay, so that kind of covers the background on what we're doing and why we're doing it. Now let's compare some actual results. So let's start off with these beets here. And these are just absolutely beautiful. Some of the prettiest beets I believe I have ever grown. Now comparing those to right here, we've already pulled these guys. We did that a video or two ago. But I'll try to throw in some footage to show you what those look like. There we go. So those beets were eaten up by insects. The leaves weren't as green and they just weren't as pretty. We made some decent sized beets, but the plants didn't look near as healthy as these guys right here in the no-till plot. You can see there, I don't have any insect damage. I'm talking not the least little bitty hole eaten in those leaves. These have a lot better color to them and they just look so much better, a lot more lush than those other ones were. And can't really argue with these compared to the others. These definitely look a lot better. So one of the many arguments for no-till gardening is that the plants are more nutrient dense, and because the plants are more healthy, they are less susceptible to pest damage. That pests tend to target plants that are not as healthy, and when they're nice and lush and healthy like this, they don't get a lot of attention from the pests. And I've always been a little bit skeptical about that, but I can't really deny it in this case. These really healthy looking beet greens haven't received any pest pressure at all, and I haven't sprayed them with anything either to keep the pest at bay because we haven't had any issues. Another thing that some of the no-till proponents will suggest is that these vegetables grown in a no-till situation just taste better. Now, I don't know how to prove that these are more nutrient dense in our situation without taking them to a lab and having an analysis done on them. But I will tell you that these are some of the best beet greens I've ever had. Usually beet greens taste a little bit like, have kind of a little bit of charred flavor, maybe a slight little bit of bitterness to them. But these here are really sweet and really good. So they taste better for sure. They don't have as much pest pressure. We can't deny that. So there's 2 wins for the no-till plot right there. Okay, so we saw the results from the beets. Now let's take a look and compare the spinach. So here's the no-till spinach, and this is a variety called Fantail. And yes, I should have cut it a while back. I've already cut it 2 or 3 times, but I wanted to just show you how lush it was compared to the other spinach, which hasn't been cut at all. So you can see nice green, dark green foliage, pretty lush. Now some of this on this end looks a little rough. I should have shot this video before we had harsh winds and 6 inches of rain this past weekend. Some of that on the end took a hit there, but some of this back here on the higher ground still looks pretty good. And I think we can harvest some of this at least one more time here. So that's the no-till spinach. And here's the spinach in the cultivated plot. Now this is a different variety. This variety is called Avenger. But I don't think this is a result of the difference between varieties. You can see there we've got a lot of pest and disease pressure on there, yellow leaves, a lot of bite marks in there. So this has been fed. We fertilized this with some 20-20-20. Just never really did anything, and just looks pitiful. Hasn't ever been harvested. I just kind of left it here because I wanted to be able to compare it to the other spinach. I'll probably scrap it after this video, but nothing ever came of this stuff right here. Now, to be fair to the other plot, these beets and this spinach that look really good now didn't always look this good. Initially, the beets that were over there and the spinach that was over there looked a lot better. It took a little while for these guys to catch up, but once they caught up, man, they just turned the corner and started looking beautiful. So it wasn't anything instant. It definitely took some time for all that biology or whatever caused this to look better to really start feeding these plants here. And we kind of saw that same kind of delay with our pumpkins and winter squash here that we have planted in the majority of this plot. These things, after transplanting, just look yellow for several weeks. Didn't look very healthy at all, and I was kind of worried if they were going to make it. But now they've kind of turned the corner and they're greening up a little bit. Not all of them. We still have a few that look a little sickly, like that guy right there. But most of them have turned the corner and are looking a lot better, got a lot better color on them, and showing some pretty fast growth. Now, for the pumpkins and winter squash, I don't have a side-by-side comparison there. I didn't plant pumpkins or winter squash in another plot to compare those two. But I've grown plenty of pumpkins and winter squash in a tilled garden, and I kind of know what to expect. Those, or that crop, is one of the more susceptible crops to pest and disease pressure, especially down here in the south. So it'll be interesting to see if these appear more vigorous or more resilient being grown in this no-till soil as opposed to what we normally see growing them in cultivated soil. So we looked at the comparison of those beets and spinach, and obviously there's some glaring differences between those two growing situations. And I should also mention that in this no-till plot, we're also not using any synthetic fertilizers. We're using all organic fertilizers. And some of these differences could be a result of just not using any synthetic fertilizers. It's hard to kind of tease those out as far as the no-till effects and the lack of synthetic fertilizer effects. So they're kind of just jumbled together here. And some of the reasons for the differences could be because no-till, some could be because of no synthetic fertilizers. I won't ever really know. But I didn't want to add any synthetic fertilizers here because that can damage the soil biology over the time. So that's why we're going strictly organic here when we do have to fertilize. And now that I'm on my second season with this no-till plot, I want to talk about some of the advantages I've seen so far of this technique, and then some of the drawbacks I've seen so far of this technique. So let's start off with the advantages, not considering what we saw earlier with that comparison. The first one will be weed pressure. Now, I mentioned we didn't do this to reduce our weed pressure. Our weed pressure isn't that bad using frequent shallow cultivation, cover crops, and tarping on the other plots. But we do see reduced weed pressure here. Now, that doesn't mean we don't get the occasional weed in here, whether that weed seed is blown in by the wind or deposited by an animal, but there are pretty few of them, as you can see here. And it's pretty easy to just come in here and pull these by hand or take a little hoe and just kind of lightly remove them from the soil and throw them out there in the grass. And the main reason the weed pressure is reduced is because we're not stirring up old weed seeds that are certainly in that soil. Every garden soil is going to have some level of a weed seed bank, but they're buried way beneath that compost there. We're not stirring them up so they can get to a level in the soil where they can germinate and thrive. So they're just buried down there and will stay buried down there forever. Another advantage I've seen so far is moisture conservation, at least once the plants get up and going. I can tell we don't have to water this plot, even though we've got drip irrigation ran underneath those pumpkins. We don't have to water this near as much as we do some of the other plots. The moisture is conserved there because we're not cultivating, we're not drying out the soil like cultivation does. That can be a good thing sometimes if the soil's waterlogged, but in here, when we're done with a crop, we're just cutting it off right above the soil. We're not pulling it up roots and all. So we've got all these kind of channels in the soil from previous crops' roots, and that's helping it retain some moisture. And it's also improving the drainage of it. We had 6 inches of rain this past weekend, and I didn't have any standing water in this plot, whereas I had plenty of standing water in some of the other plots. So moisture is definitely conserved, and you do get a lot better drainage due to those little kind of micro channels in the soil and the fact that this compost is pretty fine stuff. And the last big advantage I've seen is I don't have to use near as much fertilizer. Now, we did use some organic fertilizer on these beets and spinach. We just sprinkled it alongside the row there and just kind of lightly mixed it into the soil with a rake. But we didn't have to do that near as much as we do most of the crops in the other plots where we're injecting synthetic fertilizer every few weeks or so. So definitely less fertilizer. Now, with any gardening technique, there's going to be advantages and there's going to be drawbacks. So what are the few drawbacks of this system that I've seen thus far? Well, number one would be time. As far as the equipment I have, this takes more time to set up, to come in here and spread a whole 5 tons of compost on this plot. I don't have a tractor, so I'm just spreading it by hand. If you have a tractor, this may not be a key variable for you, but for me, when I have to spread the compost by hand, this takes a lot more time to get set up, get ready to plant, than it does when I just run through the plot with a tiller and get it ready to go. The second drawback, which is going to be dependent on the resources you have available in your area, is going to be cost. So I'm lucky enough to have a good source of compost nearby. We can get this stuff for about $20 a ton. That means it takes about $100 every time I compost or put another layer of compost on this plot. For some of you, your compost nearby is a lot more expensive than that, and this technique could get quite pricey. So depending on if you have access to good compost at an affordable price, this technique could be more expensive than a more traditional technique that we usually use. Now, the third drawback I've noticed has to do specifically with transplanting and putting these new transplants in the ground. Now, I mentioned this method does conserve a lot of moisture down when you dig a little bit deeper, but on this kind of top inch or two of soil, it stays pretty dry just because this compost is so fine. And so when we first put transplants in the ground, we have to water a lot more than we normally have to, just to keep some water around them until they develop roots long enough to get down here where all this moisture is. So initially, it does take a lot more water. Once they get roots established and start climbing down into these soil layers, moisture is certainly conserved, but initially, this takes more water. And the last drawback, which I really haven't figured out a solution for, is termination on certain specific crops. Now, with these pumpkins here, once they're done, we'll just pull out all those vines, no problem. That's pretty easy. And these beets, we're harvesting the entire plant when we pull those up, no problem. But for something like this spinach here, or if we were to plant, greens of some sort, where we got a lot of plants planted densely there, how do we terminate this? Now, you could obviously terminate it with a tarp, but I don't have just a sliver of tarp to put right here over this spinach. We don't want to come in here with a tiller and chop it all up. We could cut it low, but it's still probably going to go to seed at some point. So I haven't really figured out how to terminate beds of greens in this particular no-till situation. If you got any good suggestions on that, let me know. So you might be asking yourself, Trav, if the results from this are looking so good, why are you doing this on all your garden plots? And for me, it's an issue of scale. And this is one of the things with no-till that I find a little bit of issue, that it can be tough to scale. So I've got 10 garden plots. It cost me $100 worth of compost just to do this one plot. I'd be spending about $1,000 or more of compost once or maybe even twice a year. And that's just not feasible for me. So that's why I'm only doing it in one plot. Now, we may start doing it in a couple other plots and may slowly progress to doing more of this style if we see or keep seeing some improved results there. But right now, it's only feasible for me to just do this one test plot. And this gives me a good kind of baseline to compare everything to see if we want to do more of this in the future. And if your vegetable garden just consists of one plot, whether it be 20 by 20, 30 by 30, 40 by 40, whatever, and you have access to affordable compost, this may be a no-brainer for you. It's just going to depend on how big your garden is and what resources you have available. And the final takeaway here, my goal is not to try to tell you what style of gardening you should do. You should do whatever works for you. We are seeing that this works pretty well, but this is not the only way to garden, and I'm not going to tell you that if you don't do it this way, you're doing it wrong. I'm also not going to tell you that if you do it a more traditional way using synthetic fertilizers, that you're doing it wrong. We're just here to compare the two situations, the two growing styles, and look at the benefits, the advantages, and the drawbacks of each style. So I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. I tried to be as thorough as possible, but I'm sure I left some stuff out. I'd love to hear your comments, what you think about the comparison between the two techniques, what we're seeing here versus what we saw in the other plot. And I also love to hear about your experiences with no-till gardening. If you have any, what have you seen? Did you eventually get to the point where you didn't have to use any fertilizers? Just let me know what you think about it. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, ring the bell, like, and share this video, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.
Oh, farewell, by the beauty of your life.